What I want to do is start off with just the very basics of influencing people, particularly from a social perspective, how each other can influence one another, and then kind of do a deep dive into some of my own research, the paper that Diane sent around beforehand, just to kind of give you a sense of one small area within the broader area of influence, and then kind of point out some points and then give you some future ideas for what you can do. And I'll try to quit early so we can have some time for dialogue if you want to have it. Feel free to stop me if you have questions. So a little bit of background on social influence. There's a variety of things that we might want to influence in terms of other people. Broadly speaking, it's our attitudes, our beliefs about objects or events, maybe our emotions associated with those. And then ultimately, probably the holy grail is to try to actually influence human behavior. There's a very big developed body of literature in psychology and marketing and business in general about how to influence people. And there's a lot of reasons why we do that, right? So in terms of a business perspective, Amazon, Walmart, Nordstrom, whomever you want to pick, would love to influence us one way or the other, to go pick up that sweater off the pile, the one that's maybe got a little bit better profit for them, to try to change our behavior so we click on that link and buy a new book or whatever it might happen to be online. But there's other reasons why we might want to influence people as well, and I just threw some of those up here. I have kids. We want to make sure we change our kids' behavior. We want to make sure they go to a good school and behave well and not get in trouble. Government wants to influence us all the time. If you pay any attention to politics, the amount of influence that comes out of Washington, D.C. is pretty significant these days and kind of scary at the same level. And any kind of organization really you can think about, or an individual person. Sometimes you want to change your parents or your boyfriend or your friend to do something that they should do or shouldn't do. In all of those instances, we're talking about social influence. And I'll step back at the end about other types of influence just very, very briefly. But what I'm talking about here today is predominantly how you could influence her to do something and vice versa, and then some of the basic principles for that. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, so first question for you. Is influencing a good thing or a bad thing?
Depends.
Sorry, I heard it depends. So who said it depends? Okay, tell us what you mean.
It just depends on if what you're influencing is for the betterment of people or society, or if it can ultimately be harmful.
Okay, that's a great point. And that, even whether it's harmful or not, is also very much a matter of opinion, right? If we look at the DACA kids as just one example, whether you're for it or against it, you can look at the same coin, two very different sides, right? And I'm going to kind of go very narrow. I'm an experimental psychologist, so that means I like to control the world as much as humanly possible and then just change a couple little things and see how people behave. But in the real world, we're shaped by multiple different contextual influences, the environment, other people. The fact that you have a pink screen on your laptop back there could very well influence how I respond. Even if I pay attention to it, but that's something completely different. But it is very much contextual. In general, I would say probably many people think of kind of the negative things first, and there's some really big ones out there, right? If you think about the Holocaust in particular, and this is what motivated some of the earlier work on human influence, is how in the world could you have a whole group of people do such horrible things to another group of people, right? And that kind of question perplexes us to today, right? Even that Polish law that just recently passed about kind of whitewashing the Holocaust and not allowed to call them Polish camps, they have to be Nazi camps. And even, almost 85 years now, they're still kind of having this debate. One of the reasons why this kind of was driven, how many people know anything about the Nuremberg trials after World War II? So what was kind of the deal with that? It's called the Eichmann Defense. I think this might be Eichmann, I'm not 100% sure. I was going to check this morning, I ran out of time. But the basic idea, one of the henchmen of Hitler was Eichmann, who basically said, when asked, why did you do this? Why did you kill so many people? He says, because I was told to. That sort of kind of rings to the point of like, really? Could people do that, such horrible things by being told to? That's a form of social influence known as authority, where basically I tell you to do something and you're going to do it without thinking. So the classic study in that is the Milgram Experiment. I'm sure you guys saw that in high school at some point. How many people have not heard of the Milgram Experiment? So somebody that knows it pretty well, who wants to explain it to the class? Go for it.
So they had participants come in and they were told that you're going to, like, there's somebody in another room, they're hooked up to electrodes.
Yep.
And
This is the experimenter here.
if they,
The subject here.
they're going to be like answering questions, and if they keep getting it wrong, you need to shock them, and you're eventually going to be increasing the voltage. And so basically, the experimenter is like wearing a lab, or like a white lab coat, like a sign of authority, and they're telling the participants this is like what you're to do. And so overall, like, oh, I'm sorry. And then so there's like a recording every time the person gets shocked. They're screaming. The screaming's getting more agonizing and louder, and you think that like I think they even kind of mimic someone dying by like having like a cessation of screaming, and people were continually doing it. The person was not actually hooked up to an electrode, but the participant thought that they were.
And the important point to mirror the Eichmann part was the experimenter themselves, who basically said, you need to do this, you need to continue. So trying to mirror that idea of what happened in the concentration camps. And we're not allowed to run these experiments anymore. They have been videotaped. If you get bored, they're on YouTube. Take a look at them. They're kind of troubling at some level. And I forget what the exact results were, but a vast, vast majority of the people jacked it up as absolutely high as they could on the machine in terms of the high voltage.
There's a movie, like they came out with a movie. Now it's on Netflix called The Experimenter, which does a pretty good job of going through like even the after effects of people who like didn't go all the way up to the voltage and people who did.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
How long is it?
I mean, it's like a traditional movie, so like hour and 45 minutes.
Oh, wow, cool. Thank you. I didn't know that. So it's pretty interesting stuff. Pretty extreme stuff, though, too, right? I mean, this is kind of big time influencing, kind of off the charts. What I want to talk about today is much more about the subtle ways we influence people. So there was a study by Solomon Asch, the line study. See a couple of heads shaking. So who wants to tell us about the Asch study? You want to do that?
So they had drawn lines on the board, and they had like Confederates, so people who were in on the experiment. They had they basically had them pick out like what one was different, and they were all the same size, right? Am I correct? They were all the same size. They just like
You're supposed to.
They were like, which is alike.
Yeah. And so the Confederates all like had said that this one was the shortest one, even though it was the same length as the other one. So then when it got to the person who was the participant, they went ahead and conformed to saying that one was like the shortest line, even though they were all the same, and had them really question what they were seeing.
Right. So let's say this is the experiment that we ran and you're the subject. Everybody else in here was going to give an answer that I told them to do. By the time he got to you, so let's say we said, which one of these is the longest? And then he starts off, he goes, well, it's A, and then C and A and C. Maybe somebody says B in there as well. But when it comes down to you at the end, 75% of the time, you're likely to say B. Answer whatever the rest of the group said, either C or A, even though obviously B is the long one. And so that's, again, a little bit not nearly as strong as the Milgram experiments. It's that social pressure of you're the last one after everybody else has given a different answer. What are you going to do? So why do we conform in those instances? What's the motive as a human?
We fear being ostracized or not being part of a group.
Exactly. So and in this kind of a setting, it's kind of not that high, importance in terms of a actual outcome. So it's like, why not say what everybody else said, right? Then you don't have to worry about not fitting in. So there's two general forms of conformity. One is you want to be liked. The other one is also the desire to be right. And those two conflict. But when you have 7 people, or in this case 8 people around you saying a certain thing, when it comes to your chance, you're probably going to change your answer and switch it over. These are the kind of things that kind of traditional social influences talks about. And I got a really cool book at the end that I'll recommend to you. What I like to do now is talk about some of my own research. And the stuff, how many people actually skimmed the article? A little bit? Okay. Anybody really read the article? Wow, great. I'll give you a test. So this work I've been doing for about 20 years now, and I would consider it a form of social influence. When we get deeper into the theoretical mechanisms on this, you'll see that it's maybe not entirely social. My view of it is that it is social, but we have evidence that it's also more cognitive rather than a social mechanism. A couple things that I want to try to illustrate with this. One is how such a small, tiny little thing can have a big effect on human behavior. And our literature in marketing and consumer psychology in particular, and general psychology, has just gobs and gobs of research about how humans can be changed by just the smallest little tweak in terms of what they do, okay? And so I really want to my point here is not just to show off my research, but to really do a deep dive on one particular research area that's generated a lot of research interest, and then to illustrate to you how something so simple can change behavior, okay? So what the question behavior effect is basically the idea that you're going to ask some form of a question that at time 2, behavior associated with that question is going to change. The question can be all sorts of questions. It can be a question on a survey, like just a simple attitudinal question. Do you like to run? Yes or no. Are you going to buy a computer in the next 6 months? Strongly agree, strongly disagree. Any sort of a question like that is possible to trigger the basic question behavior effect. We've shown it in a lot of different contexts by many different researchers from all over the world. Started off in the late 1960s when a guy named Clausen, who was doing an overall voter survey, noted that turnout rates for voters were different based on whether or not they were going to be asked to vote in the upcoming election. First kind of real field work kind of a demonstration. And then it wasn't until 1980 that a guy named Jim Sherman, who's a social psychologist at Ohio State, demonstrated this in an experimental context. What Sherman did was basically put people into an experimental setting. And in one condition, we had people answer a question, or he did. In the other condition, he had them not answer the same question, and found that behavior changed in the direction of basically what social norms would predict. That's why this was originally grounded as kind of a social phenomenon, and how we view it as a social phenomenon with a group of researchers that I work with. There's other researchers around the world that are looking at it from a different perspective, and I'll talk about that here in a minute. So does everybody have the basic idea of the effect? Okay, ask a question, behavior changes.
So I guess when I was looking at this, I thought of how when journalists are asking, they're interviewing and they want to get a specific answer, they'll say, so you thought this, even though that wasn't where it was going, and the person repeats back exactly what that question was. And it's yeah, I did think this, because they're in that type of situation. Mm-hmm. It's a high pressure situation to be in the interview. But I once I realized I pick it out all the time when I'm watching it. When I was reading this, I thought of that.
Yeah, once you are aware of it, there's a lot of times we ask questions of other people. You'll see it on advertisements, they come out. I mean, presidential elections, you see it a lot. Will you vote for Obama? Will you vote for Trump? Those kind of things. And it is kind of a standard. There's something different about a question than a statement, and we can talk about that at some point. We really don't understand it, but there's something that kind of gets somebody thinking at a different cognitive level when you ask them a question about something, and it does affect the way you behave for sure. And if you think about the number of things we ask people questions about, which is kind of a side point of all this, it's kind of scary to think that a question, first of all, we rely upon those answers to make judgments and base kind of strategy and decision making around, first of all. And second of all, if you ask kids about sex or about drugs or about alcohol consumption in high school, what kind of things are we kind of doing in that regard as well? But we can talk about that later if you're interested. It doesn't really matter too much about the different terms. Just throw this up there that there's a lot of different folks working on it with a lot of different questions or phrases for what they call it. These folks are from Duke and NYU. They call it mere measurement. Sherman still is sticking to the idea of self-erasing nature errors of prediction, which I think is probably one of the worst titles of anything I've ever heard in my life. Eric Spangenberg, who used to be here at WSU, works down at UC Irvine now. And Tony Greenwald, who's a famous social psych guy over at UW, called it self-prophecy, and we relabeled it question behavior effect about 12 years ago. But it doesn't particularly matter too much about the titles. There are some differences. Most of the research has been conducted by these two groups of researchers. And the differences that we have is the nature of the question. The mere measurement folks use intention measures. So do you intend to buy a new car? Yes, no, or maybe on a 7-point scale. We typically use predictions. Do you predict you will vote in the next election? Do you predict that you will you'll recycle products, you'll go to the gym? The other thing that was different between our work is we focused on socially normative behaviors. So that's where kind of the social dimension kicks in terms of one person versus another. Whereas the mere measurement folks, Vicki Morowitz, she's at NYU, predominantly focused on business type of outcomes. So buying a new computer, buying a car, brands, shopping in a grocery store, those kind of things. Remarkably consistent sets of results between the two very different types of research activities, but different kind of results as well. So let me tell you about our work, which is self-prophecy. And what we do is we ask people a self-prediction, and what we show is the behavior changes in the direction of the social norm. So if I would ask half of you in this room, do you predict you're going to drink and drive or not drink and drive on this weekend? Don't ask the question for someone else. Our results and our research suggests that the people asked the question should have a lower incidence of drinking and driving than people that are in the control condition. And that's our basic mechanism, is that we think that, and I'll talk more about it in a little while for the theory, our thought is that the question activates these social norms about what we should behave and how we should behave, and that in turn then directs our human behavior after the fact. Okay? And I'll get to that in just a second. I want to show you a couple of experiments that we've done and kind of things that we've worked on. So it has been shown to work in voting in an election. We've shown it for cheating in a college classroom. I'm happy to share these slides too, by the way, so you don't have to feel like you have to write everything down. Including here at WSU was one of the exams. This is kind of a fun one. Basically, Eric and a guy who's over at Seattle U still named Carl a long time ago, basically in a class said, will you cheat in this class or not? Then later gave him a take-home exam with a very difficult question that you could only answer if you cheat, and found that the cheating rates were higher when there was no question compared to a question about cheating, significantly so. Not sure how they got that by our IRB, but they did. We've shown that it works at increasing attendance at a health club. That was over in Montana. We also did it out at the rec when it first opened. Early on, we also showed it worked at recycling in dorms here at WSU's. And I'll talk a little bit about the dorm study to give you a sense. So what we did was we did the dorms back by the soccer field back there. I forget what they're called, Wilmer Davis? No. Behind Global Scholars, the old ones. And basically, we went to the semester meetings with all of the dorm residents. There were 326 in the building. And then each floor, we did a treatment of either a question behavior effect or non-question behavior treatment. In the question behavior effect, we gave them a short one-page survey, and one of the questions says, using lots of products that come in containers, do you predict that you will not recycle or you will recycle? In the control condition, so 7 floors of people completed this questionnaire, 7 floors completed this questionnaire. In this one, we asked something about, would you subscribe to the Pullman Moscow Daily News or some just kind of innocuous behavior? And then we had a bunch of undergraduate students and doctoral students collect recycling stuff, cans in this instance, and found quite a big change in behavior. So this is the weeks during the semester. So for the first couple of weeks is when we did the initial questionnaire. Then we tracked behavior throughout the rest of the term. And as you can see, the recycling rates are higher across all of the prediction conditions compared to the no prediction conditions. Huh?
Did you keep track of people that answered like no to the recycling question or like against what socially would be accepted? Like, is there any impact on them?
Great question. So if you didn't hear it, he said, does it matter what you answer? There's really no evidence in any of our papers except 1 or 2 studies that what you answer actually matters. So you could say you will not, and it could still have an effect on behavior. We don't have, it's kind of hard to model individual behavior, so I know if you answered no and whether you did it or not, there's not enough power in the study to do that. But if we put in whether you answer yes or no as a variable, most of the time it does not end up as a significant effect. Which is interesting, right? I mean, one explanation for this, which we'll get to, is that if I ask you what you're going to do, you remember it, and then that's going to drive your behavior. But it doesn't seem like that's the case. In fact, you could even argue from our theoretical perspective by saying no, that it may kick in more of a mechanism to say, oh my gosh, everybody else is doing this, and I say no, I should feel bad, and then it'll drive my behavior.
Sorry. That's what I was wondering too, if it's like an illusion of autonomy, even though you're actually trying to influence behavior, like asking a question is giving somebody the choice of whether or not, but then they ultimately are influenced.
What do you mean influence of autonomy?
Or just like they think that they have the freedom to make whatever decision they want because it's a question. You're not telling them they have to do something. And so autonomy is very important to us. I don't know.
It is, absolutely.
Yeah.
That's a really good question. I think that may be part of the trick of this thing with the question, is that it's not felt as it's manipulative. It's just asking a question, then you answer it, and then all of a sudden it's like, holy crap, I answered that, so I need to respond in a way that kind of makes sense. I think there's something to that. That's a good point. Diane?
Following up on that, you said it's not manipulative, and yet all the examples that you've given are questions of, are you going to follow the responsible behavior or the irresponsible behavior? So would we expect the same influence if it was a responsibility neutral question? You know, are you going to wear blue or red tomorrow?
There are a number of studies that have pretty innocuous non-social dimensions to it. Choice of candy bars, if you're going to buy a Ford or a Chevy, those kind of things. Now, granted, there's still norms associated with whether you buy a Ford or a Chevy, but certainly a lot less than recycling or drinking or cheating, some of the things that we focus on. So that's a really interesting question. None of us that I'm aware of have done just that kind of an innocuous type of completely unimportant question. Some of the theories would predict no effect, and some of the theories we have would predict that it would probably change the way people behave.
So in a way, this is like priming the pump to move toward their social norm by asking the question.
The way we look at it, yes, absolutely. Mm-hmm.
And then what if the question doesn't have like this prediction versus intention kind of aspect? What if the question is, do you do this? Like, do you go to the gym 3 times a week? Is there an effect then on people saying, okay, I said I did, now I need to not be a liar and actually do that?
We did a study like that actually, which I was going to show you here next. And this is the one that we did at a health club in Montana. And this was kind of before electronic bill payment was, certainly in Montana, was available. So they sent out bills to people at their gym for every month. And in the mailer, we gave them a little survey and they could win something to try to make sure they paid attention. And then we changed the questions on the form between, we wanted to make sure everything was a question, kind of what you're getting at, but not quite directly. We have another study that's a little closer to what you're talking about. But what we showed is that this general, very focused question about will you work out at the Summit Health Club, which is the name of it up in the Flathead, changed behavior more so than the other conditions. And these are the percentage people attending on a daily basis over the period of the experiment. So this is with swipe data and actually people going in and out of the gym in terms of how much they were there. We're going to talk about the size of the effect in a little while. This is known in experimental world as a small to medium size effect and what that actually means. But that's statistically significant, and in the right population it could be a really big difference in terms of outcome variables. It's a good question. And you had your hand up too.
Yeah. So for the recycling example, would it be possible to negatively affect the recycling rate as well, instead of just increasing it?
Well, there's a guy at Duke named Gavin Fitzsimmons, a friend of mine, who does the same research, and he has a paper called Sex, Drugs, and Rock and Roll. I can get you the citation for it. And he has 3 or 4 studies with adolescent and younger consumers, kind of a little bit younger than you guys, down into high school, that shows if you ask about certain illicit behaviors, the prevalence of the illicit behavior actually goes up. All of our research is on a broader set of populations, and we haven't looked at like sinful behaviors for the most part. I mean, the flip side of not recycling is not good and cheating is not good, but it's not like having, unprotected sex, alcohol, drug consumption, those kinds of things. And there hasn't been any follow-up research to it, and there's a lot of debate within our field and the people that look at it whether there's actually an effect there or not. But he does have some preliminary evidence that shows within certain populations, potentially where the norms of consumption are different than broader societal norms, that you actually get the opposite effect than what we've been shown in terms of these kinds of things. And that's where it gets kind of troubling and a little bit scary. That, for, the number of surveys kids fill out, in high school and junior high school can be considerable. And if that's actually increasing incidence of the things we are asking about, that's probably not a good thing. But the problem is we don't have really good evidence on it. And it's a tough one to get past IRB, obviously. So, the effect is kind of cool in my mind. Lots of real world behavior shown. The other thing that I didn't mention, and I guess I'll go back real quick, is that these effects go on for a really long period of time. This is 13 weeks into the semester. There are at least 3 or 4 experiments where the results last up to 6 to, I think 12 months is the longest recorded difference between the two groups. So that's asking one question at one point in time, 6 or 9 months ago, has an effect on behavior in the future. Pretty cool. We have no idea why that happens, by the way. Mm-hmm.
Did you look to see if there was any kind of age effects?
Well, we ran a thing called a meta-analysis, which I don't know if you guys know what that is. Everybody know what a meta-analysis is? So what's a meta-analysis? So what's a meta-analysis?
You look in the literature for everything that you can find, and then you also contact people who may not have published their results to look at the effect over all of those studies for the particular thing.
So in a meta-analysis, an experimental finding is the data point. There could be hundreds or thousands of data points within that one study, but that one study then becomes the data that's used for an overall analysis. So sometimes when you see something in the news about multiple studies been analyzed, and if you eat green leafy vegetables, you're not going to get sick, or you are going to get sick, many times those are meta-analyses of a lot of other studies that are all combined together in the simplest way. So in our meta-analysis, we tried to include age, and we never found an effect for that, as well as other demographic variables we haven't seen much. We did find gender in one instance in terms of gender stereotyping, but it was never reported, and something that just never saw the light of day. But that's the only time I've ever seen anything. Okay. So why does it occur? Oops, that's on this slide, not that slide. So why do we, other than being professors and we have nothing better to do, why do we care about theory, and why do we want to know why this stuff happens? The psych people in the room could answer. Why do we care about why something happens in psychology?
Because it affects human behavior. And why does it affect their behavior? And what can we do to, like you said, put that in like a positive, influence behavior for positive things, but then also how do we prevent people from, performing like maladaptive behaviors?
Right. So if we know what that trigger is to get you to exercise more, or you to eat less or drink less, or whatever we want to change in behavior, if we understand what those triggers are, emotional, cognitive, physiological, then we can use those triggers to try to guide people one way or the other. Of course, that's where ethics comes in, whether you want to do that, and you should be doing that. But in general, that's why we care about theory. If we have a better understanding of what's going on, then we should be able to trigger that much more easily, okay, from a practical perspective. So this is a simple effect, right? Basic idea is this, right? You ask a question, there's some sort of outcome and behavior. Our argument is really scientific. Something goes on up here, and then behavior changes. So the big part is figuring out what's going on inside of people's heads that's really trying to make this mechanism work. The difficulty is we have a lot of different kinds of explanations out there. I think to say that it's multifaceted is absolutely correct. I think there's multiple mechanisms that are driving this going on. We've identified at least 4 that have strong evidence for them, but you probably could come up with 6 to 10 more. I have a list here in a second. And I put this question up here, but we already talked about it. And again, the reason why we care is that if we do want to use this as a form of social influence, we can use those theoretical understandings for why it changes behavior to make it more effective. Or in the instance, if we did want to try to lessen the effect, for example, when we ask about sex, drugs, and rock and roll, which is the paper by Gavin, we could also use it to tone down the effect and maybe have it not to be such a strong thing. So here's a list of theories. I'll let you read that for a second. Okay, the ones with the stars are the ones that have strong empirical evidence. I'm just going to walk through these briefly. You don't have to follow them all. There's a strong body of literature that talks about commitment and consistency. Basically, if you make a commitment now, you're going to follow through with it in the future. Really cool study in social psychology. The guy goes up, he's an experimental guy. He lays down on the beach with a blanket, has his radio. He gets up to go to the bathroom or get a hot dog. And in one condition, he says, hey, will you watch my radio so no one steals it? In the other condition, he doesn't say anything. He just says, I'm going to go get something to drink, but does not ask you to commit to help. His buddy comes along, who's an experimental Confederate, grabs a radio. This is in the 70s. They still had radios. Starts running off down the beach. Who's going to stop who or say anything? In this condition, you just watch and say, yeah, take his radio. I don't care. In your condition, you're up off the blanket, running the guy down the beach, in some instances actually trying to tackle him and take the radio back. So that is the idea of commitment and consistency. If we make these commitments, particularly if it's public and social, if I say I'm going to do something, then I'm going to likely follow through with it. How many of you have ever had an exam with an honesty pledge on the front of it? You know, I will not cheat, you sign your name. That's an example of commitment and consistency in action. Okay? So for the question behavior effect, kind of gets back to your point about the interview, whoever said about interviewing. You ask the question, you answer it, that's your commitment, and then you form a consistent response. We have evidence that suggests that it's not commitment and consistency. So we've kind of ruled that one out. Sherman talked about the idea of a script-based process, and what's a script for the psychologist people in the room? Remember what a script is from cognitive psychology?
Like their schema?
Yeah, like a schema.
Okay.
So what's a schema?
How they like view themselves and how other people view them. Like, I don't think we've ever used
How you
the word
conceptualize
script.
the world, your perspective, or
Yeah, script is a little bit more direct. It's just an executable, like a movie script. It's just like, what are you going to do in a given context? So like, if you've never ever been in Valhalla before and you walk in the door of Valhalla, I don't know how many people go in there, I had lunch there yesterday, at lunchtime, can you figure out how to order lunch without asking somebody what to do? Sure, because you've got a script. You walk through the bar, you go back to where you think you order, you look for the menu, you pick it up, you talk to the lady or the man behind the counter, and you order a salad. That's a script being executed automatically. You have all sorts of scripts for all sorts of things. How to make coffee, how to cook breakfast, get up in the morning, take a shower, all sorts of things. Many of those things are automatic. I mean, I'm getting old, so maybe you guys aren't doing this, but how many times you're in the shower and you think, did I wash my hair this morning? It's like, I think I did, but maybe I didn't. And it's like, that's just because that script automatically executes of get my hair wet, put the soap in my hand, do this. And we all have an order that we go through in those kinds of processes. So what Sherman said was that with the script, the question creates a script in our mind, and then that script of do you recycle, do you drink and drive, do you cheat, is then executed the next time a behavioral opportunity happens at time 2 or time 3. We don't have a lot of evidence for that, but there's a guy at University of Florida, a friend of mine, who's showed that this idea of response fluency, which I'll get to, sort of acts in a very similar mechanism. This attitude accessibility idea is from the folks at NYU, Vicki Morowitz. And their idea is that as soon as you ask a question, your attitudes about the particular object become active and accessible. So if an attitude becomes accessible, psych people, what should likely happen?
Generate. I mean, if you like think about it, I think about CBT, I think, when really talking about this. Like, as soon as you can access your emotion, you can understand, like, your process of thinking behind it.
And then it'll likely potentially guide your behavior. If I remind you that you really love pizza, and it becomes in your mind, ooh, I really want pizza, and then you're going to probably go and get a pizza. It's as simple as that, okay? And basic psychology is that our attitudes drive our behavior. If we like Trump, we're going to go to one of his rallies. If we hate Trump, we're not going to go to one of his rallies. And that idea that attitudes predict behavior underlies this idea of attitude accessibility, that the question just merely activates our perceptions of what we're going to do, our feelings, our thoughts, our cognitions about it, and then those cognitions and thoughts then drive the behavior. Okay? Have another paper, basically the same thing, but about normative beliefs rather than attitude. So what I think you think I should do, or my parents, or my wife, or my kids. This is our favorite theory from my group of researchers in dissonance. Can somebody remind me what dissonance is? Maybe not a psychology person in the room. Sure.
When you have two separate thoughts that are inconsistent with each other, but you still hold them.
Right. I think that's a great example. A great description. We have some sort of a disconnect in your mind, that tension, and it was figured out in the 1950s. That tension is going to drive our behavior. Probably one of the greatest social psychology theories in the world, in my mind. Maybe I'm wrong, but it really does drive a lot of behavior. So a classic experiment by the guy at Stanford who figured all this out. He had students come into the laboratory, and he said two conditions, and I'll tell you the conditions in a minute, but in both conditions you have to write a counter-attitudinal essay. Counter-attitudinal essay basically is an essay that is against your own beliefs, and in that the context is reasons why we should increase tuition next year by 20%. Does anybody in the room want, except maybe the professors so we have more money to spend, but anybody in the room want to see our tuition go up 20%? Absolutely not. So in one condition, he had paid them a quarter, a lot of money in 1957. In the other condition, he didn't have them pay any money whatsoever, okay? So both of them wrote a counter-attitudinal essay of bringing up the number of tuition rates. One got a quarter, one didn't get a quarter. Measured attitudes before and after the exercise. Whose attitudes changed in which conditions?
The ones who didn't.
What?
The ones who did not get.
Exactly. The ones that did not get a quarter, their attitudes changed. And how come that's the case?
Because getting paid is then their justification for why they said something that they didn't believe. I just said this because I was getting paid to do it. Whereas if you didn't get paid to do it, well, I don't have any other way to justify why I would say this, so it must be because I believe it.
Exactly. Very well described. So because you paid me a quarter, I have no dissonance. So the idea that I've got two competing thoughts in my mind, I'm a student who doesn't want to pay more money, and I just sat there for an hour writing an essay why we should increase tuition rates. That is dissonance. I'm holding two different cognitive thoughts in my mind associated with a particular behavior. That dissonance is motivational in nature and gets us to either change our attitudes, which happened in the case of the experiment I just explained, change our behavior, or ignore it. And we all have this, right? So if you decide, wow, I'm really trying to decide between an Apple and a Samsung laptop, you get the Apple laptop, you might really have liked that Samsung laptop, and it's like, gosh, wow, man, I should have bought that damn Samsung laptop, but now I got this Apple. That tension is dissonance. So it happens a lot in our lives. I mean, it's like, not to bring politics too much into it, but Trump is fascinating. He wears a hat that says Make America Great Again, which any American would believe is true, but if you really don't like Trump, it's like, how do you reconcile that in your head? And those kind of differences really can kind of drive a lot of behavior. So in our mind, for the question behavior effect, what we argue is when I say, will you recycle, our theory and our evidence shows that people activate norms about what they should do. I know I should work out, I shouldn't cheat, I should recycle, I should do all these things. But we also know that we're horrible at doing a lot of those things, and can think of plenty of examples when we didn't go to the gym, we didn't recycle and threw a pop can in the trash, and all sorts of things. That tension of what I know I do versus what I should do motivates the behavior change and pushes things forward. So that's our theoretical explanation. So far, attitude accessibility, I have these beliefs and cognitions about the behavior, it increases them, that drives behavior. This is more socially normative, that's why I call it social influence, because I think about what all you think I should do versus what I know I do in my heart, and that difference drives it. I'm only going to talk about these last two because these start to get really fuzzy, even for me. These are the only two papers that have experimentally showed these, but they're very interesting. So I'm going to ask you a question first. How in the world could this or this explain effects that are 6 or 9 months out? What? Did you say it again?
Did you point to?
Did you like?
Oh, I'm sorry, dissonance and attitude accessibility.
Every time you do it, you like revisit the decisions you've made. So like you continually, like you had the dissonance, for example, when you answer the question, and then every time you perform the action, you revisit that in your head somewhat, so that you continually do it and continue on that track.
That's a really clever thought, but most of the research shows that as soon as you recycle something, that dissonance should dissipate and kind of go away. Which the point is both of these really have a hard time explaining for what happens 6 months from now. Because if I answer a question on a survey that I may not even remember at time 1, and then 15 weeks later I'm still throwing a can in recycling, it's not that you've sat there for 15 weeks going, oh my God, I need to recycle more, I feel horrible, or I've got my accessible attitudes about recycling. You know, it could be for some people for sure, but it's not likely to work. So these two make a lot of sense short term. They don't make as much sense long term. These last two, however, make much more sense, and I won't get into the depth of these because if you read the papers, they're horrible. But in general, the idea is that as soon as I ask the question, it creates something in memory that will not be executed until you have another opportunity. So I could ask you a question about recycling or going to the gym, and that thing's going to sit in your head like a trap, ready to be executed the next time you get near a gym or something to recycle. And that's the basic idea of these two. But the bulk of the evidence is around these two explanations. That was pretty deep, I'm sorry, but any questions on that? Sure.
Is the actual question important? So I don't want to be political, but like I'm fascinated with Trump's speech. So like in his last speech, he was talking about his speech in the State of Union, and he said the Democrats didn't clapping or anything. So is it that treasonous? And people say, yeah, but is that question, the actual question, I think is really stupid even to ask. But it's triggered, I believe it's triggered something even in my brain, which is the actual question I think is stupid, but is it how you cook the questions to people, answer to that question is important, and how you make that question to have a huge impact to the people?
Yes, there is a lot about that. Yes, there's quite a bit of evidence we have that the way the question is asked does influence the way the behavior happens. Whether you have a forced choice, 1 or 2 options as an answer versus a sliding scale as an example, like 7 points, changes the way the effect happens. We don't have any effects on whether it's is kind of positive or negatively worded in terms of you should recycle or you shouldn't recycle. We don't have any evidence for that. But yeah, I think there's a subtlety and an art to how you ask questions. And when he presented this work in front of a guy who did negotiations for his life's work in terms of research, he said there's actually quite a good body of work on how, and I'm not aware of it, but on when you get into a negotiating setting, how you ask the question really can have a big effect the way people respond back to it, which is kind of fascinating.
I have, just to clarify, so you said response fluency and motivation intentions are more of the long-term
They're more likely to
explanation?
explain over
Okay.
the longer term,
So
correct.
then how does that work? Because you said this lasts like weeks and weeks. So is it kind of like the question activates, it'll sit in your head and be ready to be executed as soon as you can?
In these two examples,
Right,
right.
and then once you do it, is it that the attitude accessibility, the dissonance dissipates and the accessibility, you strengthen those event files, and then they're more readily accessible? And then it kind of goes back and forth between that
There's
until it becomes...
nobody's done that elaborate of a study yet, but it could easily be what you're trying to describe, and kind of overlaps with what he was just talking about, that it's some sort of a rehearsal mechanism that goes on. We do have one paper where we look at habitual behavior prior to asking the question, and to look, and it was really pretty fortuitous that we had prior behavior that we could look at to see how a question then affects the way future behavior affects. And we had some really interesting results around that, and based on whether it was normative or non-normative. So in one question we had, in one situation, like reading the newspaper, I think if I remember, it's been a long time since I looked at the data, it regresses towards the mean. Whereas if you have a social regresses towards the mean, and then the non-social kind of goes out. So basically, for example, for somebody that exercises a lot, it actually pulls down their exercise rate. When you ask them, it kind of just jogs their memory, like, oh, maybe I'm doing this a little too much. People that are low, it pulls them up, and so we see that kind of shift in behavior. It's pretty cool. Diane?
That's the aspect that really fascinates me, this draw toward the social norm. And following up on Ollie's question here, what if what you really want to try to influence them to do is for their good, but not necessarily in line with the social norm? Can question, wording, or this whole method be used to push them in a different direction?
It's a really great question, and we haven't studied that yet. I think in the right context, yes, I think you could do that. But I think norms in many of these instances, depends upon the behavior, are so strong that I think once you activate that and get people start to thinking about the behavior in regard to the norms, even if it's not mentioned directly in the question, I think it's kind of hard to steer people off. I think the norms, which is what norms are supposed to do in society anyhow. I'm not a norm expert, but I mean, it kind of pulls us all together, right? So we're not in here killing each other all the time, and kind of, it starts to direct us. So when we activate those norms and prime them, it should pull us back towards that direction, and that's kind of the bump we're seeing.
So in order to try to have an effective intervention, we need to try to find a way for what we want them to do to align with the social norm.
Yes, absolutely.
But more the people have really influential. There are people who are against the norm. They're trying to change the norm and saying why we are doing this. Let's do it that way. They people got famous, not the people who are always doing the norm.
Right, and you're right. There is a group of folks that don't have, that have an opposite norm or a different view on things, and that's where the Gavin Fitzsimmons work starts to come in, because it starts to shift things around. If you have a subgroup that has very different norms, there's been a little bit of that done in terms of like alcohol consumption with college students. I mean, what is a lot in terms of consumption, and the answer is very different for different groups of people. Certainly different for 20-year-olds and 45-year-olds or 50-year-olds.
I just wanted to make sure that I understood. The shift is towards the norm of what people actually do and not the norm of what people say they ought to do.
Correct, but in the self-erasing nature errors of prediction, when we go back to Sherman, his original work, he always looked at what people would predict. And then, so he would look at, in a control condition, how would you behave in a particular way? So it's a 40, 60, 50, 50, whatever. Then people, when he would look at the answer of what people would predict, and we have all of our data lines as well, when you mark that prediction or answer that question, you bump up what you would say you would do in a socially normative direction. And then the behavior moves in that direction as well. So that's the self-erasing nature errors of prediction. He says when we predict about future social norms, our norms, we're going to predict in the direction of norms, and then our behavior follows after. But we thought question behavior effect was a lot simpler.
So this is made for you guys. It made me think of our preventative brain health intervention for middle-aged and older adults. And each topic, like stress or exercise that we introduce, what would be like a type of question that maybe we would throw out before we introduce that topic that you think would increase the chances of us changing their behavior?
Well, I think you could aim questions at the use of the intervention itself, like, will you use this app, will you use this Fitbit or whatever you guys are working on in order to do things. So you could focus on the actual behavior of using the device. I don't think that is as good. We have one study, and we never replicated it beyond one study, but we did it with a market research class where we had students, they would call WSU students. Our old professor used to do projects for WSU about WSU issues, whatever it might be, football or updating the campus or student life, whatever it might be. And then in one of the studies, we had a question beforehand: will you fill out this survey or not? And what we found was the response rates went in the opposite direction. So even it was peer-to-peer interactions, there's this kind of some sort of a reactance, some sort of a negative response of, I don't want Big Brother to kind of influence me, and kind of it went exactly opposite of what. So we had a lower response rate for people that were asked if you would complete the survey beforehand. Haven't replicated it since, so we don't know if it's just a one-off sort of study, but I would probably go against saying, will you use this device to help monitor your health? Because I think that may cause a reactance potentially. So I think it would probably be better to focus on whatever behavior you're working on, and maybe even include it as part of the device if you can, if it's an iPad or an app or something, that the question pops up about the behavior itself, and then integrate the question and the behavior of doing whatever you need to do together. That'd be my first response. So, interesting question though, really interesting. So, when we ran the meta-analysis, this is for 104 experiments, including 2.2 million people, by the way. That's how many studies have been ran. There's one or two studies that have over 1 million people. They're voter studies. Horrible part is they didn't work at all. So when you do a meta-analysis, that's just a big zero with a weighted effect size of 2 million people. In terms of our actual experiments, we probably have around 100 to 200,000 participants across a variety of studies. The folks in the Morwitz camp have done some very big, massive surveys of consumers, so that's why the data is so high. But across all of those, our effect size for the question behavior effect is 0.137. What an effect size is basically just an empirical estimate of how strong the effect is and how big of a change in behavior we could expect to have. That is small to moderate in the world of psychology, but if you apply it, it can have big, big changes in terms of behavior. For example, in voting, if you've got some of these Trump swing state areas, you start to try to get different people to come out for voting in an election. You just call the households that voted for him last time or not, send them a survey, a text, social media, Facebook. That's the kind of thing where you can really shift people around quite a bit, or if you're looking for particularly vulnerable populations where you want to try to shift things. So the caveat is it is a small effect, generally speaking, but it's a very robust effect. It's been demonstrated in 104 studies is what we used for this meta-analysis, and it's very, very robust in that regard. So let me show you one more thing and then we're done. So what we talked about is how other people influence other people. There's a massive amount of research out there how we humans are easily influenced by the smallest things. I do pricing research. You change literally 1 penny on a price and it can shift your choice behavior. I can share those papers with you if you're interested. All sorts of different information and the way it's formatted, massive research on that. Anything in the marketing variables can be influenced. The environment around us, this color green in here, the lighting, the people, not the people, the physical environment, the noise that I hear up here, all of that can affect the way we do things. And I'll end with one real quick fun example on a thing called embodied cognition. Does anybody know what embodied cognition is? No? So it's basically the idea that our physical being and our cognitions are hooked together, and if you manipulate one, you can affect the other. So if I have you sit and do this, you're more likely to get along with another person than if I have you do this. This is a study by a guy at Michigan named Norbert Schwartz that basically he puts fish smell in the room. And so when I say something smells fishy, what immediately comes to mind? Suspicion, right? It doesn't smell so good, at least in kind of American culture, right? And basically then he puts people in a context where they should be able to behave or not in a cooperative way. In the presence of a fish smell, they're less likely to cooperate than in the presence, it's funny, he had a fart smell that he used as a control condition. So an equally horrible smell, but people are more likely to cooperate with a fart than with a fish. So that's embodied cognition. And then vice versa, he also showed that if you made people suspicious, they were more easily able to identify a fish odor in the room than people that were not suspicious. So that's the idea of embodied cognition. So just a quick example to say any kind of stimulus can change our behavior. And then the very last slide is stuff that would recommend reading. If you like this influence stuff, Bobby Cialdini's awesome. He's a marketing psychology professor at Arizona State University. Any of those books you buy are awesome. They have old versions on Amazon for like $2 or $3 you can buy. You'll love them, I guarantee it. If you're interested in taking classes, consumer behavior or social psych would be the two that I would highly recommend. And then I can send you papers on my stuff if you like.